Okay, good afternoon. Sorry to start speaking while some of you are still having your lunch, but I have to get going. So my name is Eric Wishart. I'm the Vice President of the FCC, and I'm also a journalist with AFP News Agency. I'd like to introduce our guest speakers this afternoon. Beside me, Selina Cheng, who's an investigative reporter for HK01, Rachel Blundy, fact-checking editor from AFP News Agency, and Masato Kajimoto, who's an assistant professor at Hong Kong University, and who specializes in studying disinformation and media literacy. And just to start. Benny? Okay. So, I do quite a lot of talks on fake news, actually, and if any of you have come to the journalism conferences, it's a topic that comes up quite a lot. Actually, it's never been very easy to get good examples from Hong Kong, up until 3 months ago at any rate. Since 3 months ago, we've been spoiled for choice. And the thing about fake news, it covers a multitude, and we're going to discuss this today. It can be anything from what this appeared to be, the friend of a friend told me, to serious state propaganda. And it can be amusing, or it can have very serious consequences. So I just wanted to kick off with a couple of examples. This was Fanny Law, who is one of Carrie Lam's advisors this week, said that young girls were offering free sex to protesters, and which prompted Carrie to come out and issue a warning about fake news. So it was quite good timing. The other one, again, serious story, is this recurring story that protesters have been killed during the police action, including in an MTR station. And the government, again, has been obliged to come out and deny it. So Selina has been covering this, and for journalists these days, as much as your first-hand sources, people you speak to, people you go and see, things you witness in the street, of course, information on social media and on messaging apps are things you have to follow up. And you've been exposed to a lot of these very serious hoaxes, rumors, unsubstantiated stories circulating on local messaging apps in particular. So could you please explain and tell the audience what your experience has been?
Hi, I work in the local press here for HK01. We publish only in Chinese, and my work is entirely in Cantonese and traditional Chinese. So I'm going to give 3 different case studies that's really caught on lately during this news cycle since June. So I have to stress that it's not some sort of industry standard or some sort of code of journalism that I'm following, but I'm just going to explain to you why, for me, as a reporter here, these are not stories I would pursue. And in fact, these are stories that very quickly, as soon as they surface in my mind, it's something I've already isolated from something that I actually have to look at. But it was different types of people who come to us and say, why are you not covering this or looking into this more seriously? So the first one is a gang rape story from a detention center in the far northern end of Hong Kong, bordering Shenzhen. It's called Sun Oak Lang. It's a detention center where people that was used to detain illegal immigrants, and it was basically vacant for decades until it was reused recently to arrest and detain protesters. So the story goes that the detention center was a black box, and lawyers were not allowed to approach their clients even as they were nominated. And so once the protesters were released, the stories saying that they had broken bones and serious injuries, and one of them, some of the female protesters were raped and gang raped. And as soon as I heard this, it sounds like a very exaggerated story, and I didn't really look into it. And then it started to catch on. And I looked on Telegram, which is one of the main channels of information where messages are distributed. And people very often repost from Telegram to Facebook to this forum called LIHKG, Lin Dang in Cantonese. So the good thing about Telegram is I'm able to search for the first message that appeared very quickly, which is the one on the left. And it says that there is a female protester who was raped by police in this detention center. And you can see that there's a recording above this text message. And the recording actually says a very different story, that there are different numbers of people raped and gang raped in different ways. So that's already a very big troubling point, that the text circulated much further than the recording. It was sent at the same time by the same user, but the stories are different. And the one on the right is Lester Shum, who posted on his Facebook. He's quite a prominent and famous activist since Occupy. And so, whoops, I must have clicked the wrong thing. And so Lester, yeah, sure. And so it mattered for a lot of people that Lester Shum posted this, because he's famous and he must have a lot of sources and in touch with protesters. And following that, a lot of similar posts appear claiming that I know this is true because I'm a social worker or I'm whatever job, and it's impossible to fact check, but I know it's true because I trust the person who told me. So it seems very strange to me as a reporter who's worked on sexual assault stories and investigations that someone would say this is impossible to fact check, because we all know that sexual assaults and crimes like this could be prosecuted in court even decades later. So even if the victim doesn't want to talk, even if they didn't go to hospital, it's always possible to pursue it. So the reason we've heard about all this and decided that is not possible to pursue is because a lot of them come from the sort of line that says, I know this is true, it must be true, and I heard it from a friend. And when you ask who this friend is, it usually goes to say that's from a friend of a friend of a friend. And so if you see this image on the left, it says that I'm a social worker, and I've heard it from a social worker, a university friend, and he handles the case. So the person who wrote this Facebook post is the third person. Her social worker classmate is the second person, second source, and then the case is the first source. So by the time the reader reads this post, they are the fourth degree of separation from the victim. And to think that, it seems easy to trace four people in the line of communication back to the source. But if you think of the unscientific theory that the whole world could be connected by 6 degrees of separation, meaning that me and Donald Trump has 6 people between us, you can realize that it's pretty impossible to trace. And so I've added this, who's an author, who has an account on Facebook that's fairly popular, and he basically says, oh, you don't have to fact check this because I've heard it, and even though it's not completely verified, but it's definitely not fake. So I think there's an alarm bell that will ring off when you see a lot of posts that says there's no need to fact check this, or you can't fact check this. So the second story that's really caught on and still ongoing in the news cycle right now is that the story that says that there were 3 people who disappeared or even died at Prince Edward Station since August 31st. So I'm sure you've seen some pretty brutal images of the police beating up some protesters or just regular commuters in the MTR in Prince Edward Station. And the story started because reporters were not allowed in the station. They were basically kicked out for several hours that night as the event unfolded. And when the government published figures of injured persons, they changed the figure from 10 people to 7. And they are still not able to explain fully explain how the change happened. And so after this, people said there must be something strange going on, not right, because they kicked out all the reporters and then they shuttled the injured persons from one station to another and sent them to a hospital that's not the closest to the site. And then on the left is this WhatsApp conversation claiming to be somebody who's the wife of a police officer who knew what happened and said, and sort of accepted and said that somebody died. And then on the right side is a message on Telegram seeking somebody who works in hospital mortuaries to confirm that they actually received some protesters who died on site from the beatings. And so, of course, none of this was returned any positive fact-checking efforts. Nobody were able to verify them. And I added this slide because it's a post on Facebook. It's kind of funny. It says that I've got a friend who has supernatural powers, and they saw that there were ghosts in the Prince Edward Station of so-and-so details. And these are stories that seem a bit ridiculous and far-stretching. How could 3 people die in a very crowded station at this time and nobody know about it? Because even if one person dies, there will be hundreds of people, in the chain of events who would know about something. But this rumor did have real-world consequences because protesters and other, Hong Kong people started putting flowers at Prince Edward Station to mourn for these supposedly dead people, and then some even went in the station and then kneeled in the station for several hours begging the MTR not to destroy the CCTV footage and to release them. And so these gatherings also became sort of conflict incidents in the following days, and more people were hurt or arrested as a result. This is a video that's interesting because it's filmed by Hong Kong Free Press's Tom Grundy. It was put on his their website, I think. And
Do you both live in Mong Kok?
Yes.
I'm
Hong Kong people.
I'm not living in Mong Kok, but we are Hong Kong people.
有其他就係我嘅朋友，係示威者嚟嘅。
So what would you like to see from the MTR and from the
跟住
police?
佢嘅佢淨係得佢父母，佢父母咧已經好大年紀去警署嗰度，就係話要翻佢哋條女嘅屍體就好，亦都要交俾佢就軟禁咗佢。依家我個朋友嘅父母都打唔到個電話。
The parents of her friend want to take the top of her friend from the non-operating station, but the boy is there.
okay, I'll stop it there. I don't know how to.
What did he say?
So what he said was, the lady said, I know some of my protester friends who died here, and I know her parents. She's in this photo that's being stuck on the station, and her parents are now being detained at their home as they try to retrieve the corpse of their daughter. And it was told to Tom Grundy, and Tom Grundy basically did not react at the word corpse and just let it finish. And the lady didn't give further details. So, and it became sort of a smoking evidence that this is the eyewitness of people around this victim. It must be true because she's being very specific about it. So Tom and I are very good friends, and we did discuss it. He admitted that he didn't catch on those words, that it happened, and it was very chaotic, and a lot of people believed that day while he was there during the Vox Pops that somebody died. And as there's no further evidence showing that somebody did die or disappear, all we have is a data gap going from 10 injured persons to 7. So our only guess is that a lot of people do read things off the internet and then internalize them, maybe consciously, maybe unconsciously internalizing, and then tell it as a first-hand story. That's the only rational, sort of reasonable explanation we can get. So as a reporter, day to day, there are people who call us and tell us that I saw this or I heard this from a friend who experienced this firsthand. But when you ask further, it's not actually that. They actually read it off somewhere. The third story that I'm going to give is being caught on more on the pro-Beijing side than the protesters' side. And it's important because it's a story that's been circulated in state media on CCTV and other related, such as Global Times. So the story is about a volunteer nurse who got shot in the eye. And these are the images from the event. So I guess for those who don't believe in the rumor, the fake news story, so to say, she was hit by a beanbag round from police who were firing from a platform high up in a police station in Tsim Sha Tsui. And I think this happened on maybe 1st or 5th of August, I can't remember. And it started becoming a rumor that she was not actually hit by a beanbag round because of the image on the left. And it's an image on cable TV, and it shows that there's nothing stuck in her goggles. So the rumor says that she was not fired by a beanbag round because it wasn't in her goggle on the left image as it is on the image on the right. So the image on the right must have had evidence planted into the goggles because you can't see it from the live stream image initially. And then there's the image below, which is from Apple Daily. And I think you can quite clearly see, as the red arrow pointed out, that there is something stuck in the goggle, and it was kind of folded inside, inwards. And so there's these disputes about these images. And then, so the story started to evolve and says that the nurse was hit by these beads by a protester using a slingshot. And it says that she can't have been hit by the police because she was standing behind a bus station, and the police station was at an impossible angle unless the bullet could, travel in a curve. So there were images and video of people using a slingshot, although it's not clear where exactly that was or whether it was the same time the lady was hurt. But anyway, this story about the slingshot caught on, and it was repeated by an ex-Hong Kong health official who's quite prominent. And he repeated it at a public occasion and was picked up by the press. So a lot of people, such as the user on the right-hand side of the screen, says even Dr. Ko, who is this ex-government official, confirms that she was hit by beads from a slingshot. And the story was further elaborated in state media, which is CCTV and Global Times. And it says that this same person, before she was hit, she was distributing money to other protesters, and she's hurt by this really stupid peer of hers. So I like to go back to these three images because it's really interesting that you can't see it from some photos, but you can in some others. It's possible that things moved in between and it made things more visible than a moment ago. And it simply tells you that you don't necessarily have the truth even when you have multiple images of the same event as it happened. And I think the Apple Daily photo is quite it's quite strong evidence, but a lot of people don't see it, especially from the pro-government or pro-Beijing camps, because Apple Daily is behind a paywall now, and a lot of people don't subscribe to Apple Daily if they don't like their position. So, conspiracy theories exist everywhere. I mean, it's a big thing in the US, and it's a big thing everywhere. And they are dangerous because not because those are fake or ridiculous stories, but because once you believe in a conspiracy theory, anything else would be discredited unless they fit your theory. So such as in this post on the LIHKG forum, it says that the Prince Edward incident is scary because if you think of it, at the end, all fact-checking efforts could be fraudulent. So to me, the most important things from these three cases are not whether what the facts are, but what narratives do these fake stories reflect. So the first one about the gang rape, it reflects that Sun Oak Lane Detention Center is a black box, the police is brutal, they don't treat female protesters with appropriate action and respect. The second story, which is the Prince Edward story, tells you a similar story, that the police is brutal and the government is trying to hide everything from the public. And the third story, with the slingshot protester hitting a fellow protester nurse, it reflects that the narrative that protesters are stupid and clumsy and naive and they receive cash, and that very conveniently fits into the Beijing government narrative of Hong Kong being a color revolution. So we could say that these three fake stories are fake and they could be ignored, but they do tell us very valid concerns about what the public is thinking. So we all know that, you know, a novel is fake, but the emotions it depicts and conveys are not. The person who reads a novel knows that the story is fake, but they do feel things that these characters are experiencing in a fictional setting. And so very often, these fake stories do have real-world consequences and implications, as we learn. So I think this is something that, as reporters, we should very much be aware of.
Thank you. Interesting. Thank you. Rachel? I knew what the three stories were, so I thought we'd move to something a bit silly just to move on. This was... the brother Cream did not get gassed, actually, right?
Yeah, so this is a story we did on AFP Fact Check. We launched kind of in June at the beginning of the protests, and this is one that happened that came up quite recently. There was a photo that was put on Facebook by a cat owner who simply said that his cat was suffering from the effects of tear gas, and this photo got misinterpreted, I think, because of the way that the cat owner described his cat, might have used a word that was mistranslated and got picked up as meaning Brother Cream, who is a very famous Hong Kong cat. If you don't know about him, you should definitely look him up. And so we decided, you know, this was prominent enough to deserve a fact check. And everyone's very concerned about the welfare of Brother Cream, so we thought it was important to put everyone's mind to rest. And it turns out it was a different cat. We did some additional verification work to be absolutely certain that it's not the same cat. As you can see, it has different markings to Brother Cream. And this was our fact check headline in the end. We actually spoke to the owner of Brother Cream, who clarified that the cat is fine. More serious story, which Selina touched on just now.
Rachel, sorry, did we just wind it back slightly? Can you explain? Sorry. No, not the slides. Can you explain a bit what you're doing at AFP? And,
sure.
And I mean, AFP has this partnership now in more than 20 countries with Facebook. Well, it's a collaboration with them. And we've just started, I think, this week in Hong Kong, right?
Yeah, so officially...
So can you explain how it works, basically?
Yeah. Sure. So officially we launched in Hong Kong last week, but we had a sort of soft launch at the beginning of the protest because we decided there was so much fact-checkable content out there, and disinformation was rife as the protests really kind of took off. But we have fact-check reporters across Asia, and Hong Kong is our editing hub for all of those stories. I'm on a team of about 4 full-time editors, and we're looking at information that's being circulated on social media in the local languages, but also sometimes in English. And essentially what we're doing is trying to comprehensively debunk disinformation that we see circulating. So we have to be quite careful because with conspiracy theories, as Selina mentioned, there's so much doubt surrounding them that you can end up creating more kind of misinformation if you don't debunk them comprehensively. So we tend to focus on fact checks that we can show visually, often using UGC, user-generated content, so that's photos and videos primarily. that we can show has either been manipulated or has been circulated before an event in a different context, so we can be certain that it doesn't show what people are trying to suggest it shows. And yeah, so we have a contract with Facebook where we can rate things on Facebook in their platform as false or misleading if we find that the information is wrong and is getting huge traction. And that means that when someone tries to share that post in the future, they will get an alert saying AFP has fact-checked this. Are you sure you want to share it? They still have the option to share it because we're not censors, we're not being aggressive like that. We're just offering a service. But hopefully it will alert certain people that the information they're looking at is not necessarily true. And it also, when we rate a post in Facebook, it can be a Facebook post, but it can also be an Instagram post or a Twitter post. It relegates that post in the Facebook algorithm, so it's less likely to be prominently shown on people's news feeds. So it's a public service in that sense. Yeah, and so in Hong Kong, it's been a really interesting time as a journalist on both sides, reporting the genuine news, but also reporting the false news. This is a fact check that we wrote just recently about what happened in Prince Edward. Our way into this story was to focus on these letters which you see on the right-hand side of the slide, which were letters from local schools about recent student deaths. And people were sharing these letters and suggesting that they were proof that students died in the MTR that night or shortly after that night. So we spoke to the two schools that had sent these letters out, and we got confirmation that in fact these deaths are unrelated to what happened in the MTR. We also got follow-up comments from MTR, hospital authority, the government, clarifying what happened in Prince Edward. So we found it more useful in this situation to focus on these letters, because the wider conspiracy theory is so huge now that we need to be specific in what we're fact-checking. This is one you might have seen if you're a journalist working here in Hong Kong. This got a lot of traction on Twitter because it involved New York Times workers and journalists. The pro-Beijing side are very keen to discredit this movement, and this photo was shared widely in pro-Beijing groups trying to suggest that this man was some sort of foreign commander instructing protesters what to do on the ground. But actually, he's just someone who works for the New York Times. And the screenshot you see that was shared of him, it was very simple. You can just zoom in on that screenshot and you can see the name of the journalist who he was actually messaging, who is Ezra Chung, who works for the New York Times. And we spoke to Ezra and we spoke to Austin Ramsey. And it's very simple to kind of debunk that kind of thing. But these posts do get huge traction, particularly on these pro-government and pro-Beijing Facebook groups. People aren't interested in the truth, so we thought it was important to expose the ridiculousness of this.
I think it's also a good example of be careful who's looking over your shoulder, because this guy's just sitting quietly on the steps with his mobile phone and somebody's taking pictures of his messaging.
For sure. We're seeing this more and more where any foreigner at the protest is a target, unfortunately. So if you're not clearly marked as press, then there seems to be a lot of suspicion now about what you're doing at the protests, and whether you're working for the CIA or any other sort of similar intelligence service. Obviously, when it reaches that level of conspiracy, there's not really a comprehensive way of us debunking that, but this one was a lot more straightforward. This goes back to the beginning of the protest. This is a fact check that I wrote myself. And I should say that I wrote this in the context of also verifying videos of genuine police brutality for my colleagues on the general news desk in Hong Kong. And we looked at this many, many times because it's quite difficult to see, but essentially people shared this suggesting that the police officer shot a protester directly in the head. And when you watch the video, the protester is kind of moved away by a friend immediately after this, and you don't really see what happens to her. The video just stops. But we slowed the video down, and we were able to, definitely see that actually what happens is a police officer pointed his baton directly at the protester before a tear gas canister was detonated and thrown. So that's the noise you hear in the video. It's quite a loud explosion, and people mistook the baton and the explosion for a gunshot. It was only a 10-second video, so I can see why people shared it, perhaps mistakenly. It's not always malicious, the spread of disinformation. It can just be accidental. And yeah, we just matched up the video with images that we had of police batons, and we could be sure that that's what happened. And also, to be absolutely certain that the woman wasn't injured, I was able to track down corresponding footage of the same incident that was actually filmed on Facebook Live. A man was standing just to her left throughout the whole incident, and she walked off on her own without any help from anybody after this incident. So that was reassuring. Incidentally, that Facebook Live has now been taken down, but at the time it was very useful evidence.
Rachel, I mean, you've done a lot of fact checking. Is there anything peculiar about the kind of fake stuff that's circulating in Hong Kong that makes it different from what you see in other countries? Is there any particular trends? Or?
I would say, in general, the conspiracy theory element has really taken off in the last few months. We see that more in North America, whereas what we see in other parts of Asia is people misusing old photos and videos a lot from previous events or from other countries. So we see this particularly in India. There will be an old incident from Pakistan that they will have footage of, that they will recirculate and suggest that it's happening in India. And in Hong Kong, we don't tend to see that. We sometimes see examples from Taiwan being misused because, there's a similar kind of language there, and there are some sort of similar features in Taipei that might be mistaken for Hong Kong. But I think in general, the conspiracy theory kind of disinformation is what is really taking off. And I've been kind of stunned by the growth of these pro-police groups, particularly on Facebook. They're getting huge numbers, and the same posts are recurring consistently across all of them.
Masato? Yep. This was the slides when... so we'll broaden the discussion a bit to what Facebook and Twitter both said were state interference by China quite directly. What, right. two or 3 weeks ago, they took down these accounts, and they said this was coming from China. It was disinformation, and it was aimed to cause dissension within Hong Kong. So, right. So what's your take on this?
Well, they're essentially saying that that's a coordinated propaganda effort, and it included lots of false information and false news, but also incendiary commentaries, very opinionated, posts that are trying to agitate people. So when you talk about propaganda, we are not just talking about false news, right? It's much bigger campaign of messaging to target audience. And I think if we are talking about state-sanctioned propaganda campaigns, they have to have probably multiple target audience. One is obviously people in Hong Kong and people in overseas consuming information in English, and also people who are living in mainland China. And as far as the people living in China is concerned, I think their campaign has been quite successful. But
this is the actual official Facebook post when they announced they were taking down these...
Well, Facebook took
But that's
down-
how they announced it, but I'm saying this is how they flagged it. I mean, they were quite specific in
Oh,
in their
Twitter,
announcement,
I don't remember the exact numbers. They suspended many accounts and 200,000 accounts suspended, and they took down, actually closed many more accounts, right? Facebook was much more lukewarm. It was just 9 pages or something like that.
And Twitter even said they tipped Facebook off, if you
So
remember.
Twitter said they will no longer receive money from state-owned news organizations like CCTV. So before they could actually boost CCTV posts because they pay to Twitter, so Twitter can, increase the visibility of sponsored content, but they are no longer doing that. But Facebook is still taking money from everybody, including Chinese media. Right. I think what Selina mentioned is something that I probably want to bring out here. False information or false news doesn't necessarily divide the society. As far as it's not really scientific, but observational research we have been conducting suggests that the more polarizing the topic is, it's easier for people to believe false information. So it's a symptom of polarized society. It's not the cause of polarization itself. And I think what we are seeing in Hong Kong is a quite good example of that. If you think about Hong Kong before June, let's say in May, there's an accident in Prince Edward MTL station, and there's a press conference. Police, hospital authority, the government, who was the fourth one? Fire department. So 4 organizations had a joint press conference denying that nobody died. If that was in May, probably most people in Hong Kong would say, oh, then that was a rumor, right? Nobody died. But now, situation's completely different. Why? Because we already are in this condition where whatever you hear from the other side, you don't listen, and you think it's all conspiracy. Somebody's hiding something. So that condition sort of accelerates the phenomenon that Rachel just described. Now we are in this situation where we are so prone to, believing in false information.
How effective, is propaganda, disinformation on a Chinese state level? How effective is it in Hong Kong and outside Hong Kong?
I think it's not working in Hong Kong. There are lots of, Hong Kong internet users are quite smart. So anything that is written in simplified Chinese, they immediately dismiss as 50 Cent's Army, right? They don't really take it at its face value. In the international space, so there are a bit of differences. So in countries where you have press freedom, where you have a lot of choices, where you can get other information and news about Hong Kong from different sources, people are not believing what Chinese government is saying. But there are many countries, let's say in African continent or South America, or in Asia too, like Cambodia, Laos, where countries where the information is tightly controlled, press that is not free, you can't really get other stories. And Chinese government is spending a lot of resources to influence local media in those countries. So let's say, for example, footages from CCTV can be used completely freely by local media. And if I'm running a news operation in Cambodia, and I have a free footage versus AP footage, which I have to pay a lot of money, I will take the CCTV one, right? And it's not in English, it's in local language. So in those countries where press freedom is not guaranteed, it's much more effective to propagate certain narratives. And I think Chinese government is successful in certain countries that way.
And when they accuse the Chinese government of being behind these disinformation campaigns, just as the Russians are often accused, right, how can you actually prove that? How can you trace it back?
Well, my specialized area is news literacy. I'm not so much concerned about the supply side of misinformation and disinformation, because I think ultimately how we can combat is the demand side. And you can see that in some countries like Finland and Japan, there are lots of misinformations and rumors and other problematic content, but they don't spread. People are much more discerning when they start to share or talk about certain information. And on the demand side, you could actually block that kind of effort. And at the moment, as far as I can tell, what Chinese government is doing is not as sophisticated as Russian government has been doing. The Russian strategy is that you take any polarizing issue, it doesn't really matter, and you implant disinformation on multiple sides. So if Last Jedi, the Star Wars movie, becomes controversial slightly, and they will start posting that, well, it's because of that Vietnamese actress, that's the cause. So they don't care. They just want to cause conflict among people. And that's where they see, so basically they throw lots of different disinformation and see which one catches fire. Whereas at the moment, Chinese government is much more focused on political issues only, and that's kind of researchers can actually see through it. So when they expand their effort to other areas, I think this conversation space in Hong Kong will become a bit messier. Yeah.
Thanks. So I think we've time for some questions. So, right? Yep. I'll stand up. And please give your name and if you have an affiliation, your affiliation.
I'm Sheridan Presso. I work for Bloomberg. And I was very interested in, you touched on the idea about the Chinese state-directed disinformation campaigns. And I wonder if those of you who are working on the counter-narratives, right, the ones that seem to be favoring the protesters' side, if you see any coordinated action there. So, in other words, is there a propaganda department for the protesters who are putting out this information consistently?
I've thought about that. It's actually way easier to identify sort of coordinated disinformation from pro-Beijing sides because especially by looking at what's permitted in Chinese platforms and Chinese publications, as in mainland ones, because they do censor it. And so all you have to do is look at what's left there. Then that's the permitted narrative and the permitted stories. With the ones that favor protesters, it's much harder because they get traction sort of more organically. They're not censored proactively. But I would think, I would guess that there is some sort of coordination because, for example, with the rape story, there are for sure multiple sources saying very similar stories to different people, and they sort of circle back to me through different channels. So it would seem that if the victim was very keen on keeping a low profile and keeping it secret, then it wouldn't be possible to have different people from different spheres or different lines of work to have heard similar things. So my only guess is that some groups are distributing the information on purpose to, for example, social workers and so on. Yeah.
Yeah, I would agree with the idea that on the pro-protester side, it's kind of developing a bit more organically. It's not such a coordinated campaign. You see posts just being copied and pasted a lot, but that doesn't mean that they're all kind of speaking to each other and deciding we need to spread this message. It's just a bit like the post that Selina showed about the alleged gang rape. It's just that people believe this and then they copy and paste it and share it. They don't have any evidence for it, but that kind of adds to the conspiracy. Whereas from my experience on the pro-Beijing side, it's on a higher level, and there's more suggestion that page admins on Facebook are kind of talking to other page admins, and they're all sharing information across groups and doing it in a much more deliberate way. I would also say that protesters are potentially sharing a lot on Telegram on closed, encrypted apps for their own community, not necessarily for public dissemination.
I think, yeah, if you compare the numbers of people who are sharing those information, definitely pro-protester side has much bigger audience, so to speak. So I would agree that it's more organic. And also, I'm repeating myself here, but when we say propaganda, we are not just talking about false information. There are lots of like great artistic works that I'm sure you've seen many of those political artistic works protesters are sharing, or Glory to Hong Kong music that was organically sort of composed by different internet users. That's part of the propaganda too. I mean, or at least a campaign to push certain narratives, right? So that's in between maybe news about gang rape. They are sharing tens and thousands of those informations as well. That is sort of confirming their political stance. So that's something that we should be aware of. I mean, we should be talking more about, because at this point, reconciliation becomes much, much harder if this continues.
I mean, I don't know how many of you have seen it, but there's the video of Glory to Hong Kong with the band, or is pure political propaganda. Have you seen it? It's very dark, protesters with the scenes from the protests. I mean, it's just a pure piece of classic political propaganda.
But if you are a protester, that
Sure.
video makes you feel proud, and we are fighting for the freedom, fighting for democracy. So I think
you haven't
it's
seen
very
it, look it
effective.
up.
And you cannot really judge that kind of content whether it's true or not, because it's not. It doesn't matter, right? It's not news. Yeah.
Jürgen Kracht, Fiducia. If I may, I have two questions. The first one is, doesn't the press also have a responsibility, like about this rape story? Why is it on page one in big headlines instead on the last page in a small article? Because I think this is being accelerated and the press is part of that. And my second question is, what is happening to the trust in government institutions with all what's happening?
Let's take the first question. Do you want to talk?
So the first question, with the gang rape story, it hasn't really caught on in the press, so it's not reported as news. But the Prince Edward one has, because there are unexplainable holes of information, so the press reported it as, mysteries in these different instances of the same event. I don't think any Hong Kong local press has reported disappearances or death as fact or news, but rather point out that, this number is unexplainable, or this incident is unexplainable, so on.
Yeah,
what that's called is amplification. And this Carrie Lam incident was classic amplification. A friend of a friend said that there were comfort women, terrible term to revive from the Second World War. Girls offering free sex to protesters, just tittle-tattle rumours. Then it gets picked up by Fanny Law, who amplifies it. Then Carrie Law amplifies it by saying it's fake news. And then it ends up on the front page of a newspaper. This is pure amplification, which is what you're talking about. And I think the dilemma, maybe, Rachel, you can talk to that, is at what point does a rumour reach that critical mass when you have to give it that oxygen of publicity, as it were, to debunk it? When does the tipping point come?
Well, for us, we constantly ask that question, but we always want to be certain that we can write a watertight fact check. So that's why with Prince Edward, we actually held off for a long, long time until we had some examples of posts which we could comprehensively debunk, because otherwise we're just speculating. And I agree that I think, unfortunately, with that story, the local press, in the end, had to cover it in some way, because there was so many people gathering in Prince Edward, laying flowers, and then there was a series of conflicts outside the station. You can't just ignore why people are there and ignore what people are saying. Perhaps you just have to put it in the correct context and, repeat that there is no evidence that anyone died.
I think it's really important to monitor and see, when it reaches the point where journalists have to really investigate. In this particular case of what happened, or what didn't happen in Prince Edward, is that on September 4th, Nancy Pelosi in the US made a statement which referred to tragic loss of life because of the protests in Hong Kong. And as far as I know, nobody has been killed. So she's clearly getting that information from the rumors that have been going around in Hong Kong for 4 or 5 days. And that really worries me, because if once policymakers, well, Fanny Lo and Carrie Lam as well, when policymakers believe in inaccurate information and make decisions based on that, and that's a real tragedy that I think journalists have a huge responsibility to correct that before they do anything.
So we're actually over time, I'm afraid, but I'd just like to ask. Okay, should take a question from the veranda.
Hi, sorry, I know we're running over time, but I had a question. We've seen tech companies like Facebook and Twitter be pretty divided in their views on fake news. So on one end, they're pulling down accounts which they say are spreading fake news, and on the other hand, like you said, Rachel, there are a lot of fake news stories that are being circulated, which are being flagged and they aren't taking down. So I think it's a bigger and broader question about, should tech companies be part of the conversation on regulating fake news? And if so, can they do it without a bias?
It's a really complicated question, and I wouldn't like to speak for the tech companies, but I think there has to be a balance between moderating and, going too far. Facebook, I know, have moderators who are looking for either very violent or very sexual content that, shouldn't be shared. And then we are on the news side, we're trying to look for things that are causing harm and spreading misinformation. But I do think that the setup that we have is correct. I don't think things should be deleted because we've fact-checked it. I think ultimately we need to allow for freedom of expression, and it could be very dangerous if fact-checkers were able to censor content. What I would say is the effect of our fact check sometimes is people actually delete their posts, because if they continue to keep the post up, then they will lose certain traction on Facebook. And some of these Facebook groups are making money through having so many followers. So it's in their interest to keep the tech company happy in that instance. But it's a really complicated debate, and I think every tech company has to find its own way through this. And as the public and as social media users, we need to hold them to account as well.
Masato, you talk to the big tech all the time. I think you were at an event in London last week with Google. So how do you think big tech should deal with this?
I need 2-hour lecture time to tell
Sign
what I
up
think.
for your
But
course.
I agree that the tech companies have a role to play, big role to play. And I stop that because, again, I can't possibly elaborate in 5 minutes. Yeah.
Anyway, just to wrap up, any quick bit of advice for people consuming all this fake stuff? How do you deal with it? Is it a media literacy issue at the end of the day, or just people here consuming information being spread on their messaging apps or social media? What do you say? Any basic rules?
I would say don't stop using social media because of this. It's still a really valuable resource, and things are often breaking on social media before they appear on a mainstream media site. So just be aware that things need to be verified before they can be run in the mainstream media, and read a variety of sources.
Last word, Selina?
Yeah, on the basic rules, I actually got this noted in my notebook, so I'm going to say it. The first one is, the more serious the allegation, the higher standard of proof for everything we do. The second is, if the story sounds too good to be true, it probably is. And good not meaning positive, good meaning whether it plays into a certain narrative.
I think this is what I tell to many of my students. They have busy studying other subjects as well. They can't always fact check by themselves. So I tell them that, well, if something looks too good to be true, or if you're emotionally a bit reacting too quickly, then wait until like AFP or HK01 or somebody fact checks that information, because you have the luxury of time, right, to wait before you share. For journalists, it's a very tricky situation. Even though you are monitoring and waiting for the point, other people are already sharing. Your competitors might be running the story. So I think it's a very tricky situation. So you really have to think about, for me, the important thing is the impact. If this has proven to be false, what impact does it have? If you think that this is an outrageous story, many people believing it, but at the end of the day, if it turned out to be false, what harm would it do? If it's harmless, I would probably ignore the cat story. I'm sorry, but if I'm the editor, I would assign you to do something a bit different than that. Although I know that that kind of story will get lots of clicks. I read it, obviously, when you posted. So I'm conflicting myself, but...
Everybody read it, Masato.
Yeah, I know. But on the other hand, if you are thinking about allocating resources as a news organization, clearly you have to think about the impact on the audience. Yeah.
Okay, with that, big thank you to our panelists. Thank you.